We've come to Numbers 21. It's a long but satisfying chapter. We need to follow the geography in this chapter. As we go along, remember that Israel is going to trace a fish hook in the shape of the letter J. They're going to trace it from the hook point around the bend to the top. I'll tell you where we are on the hook as we go along. Numbers 21, verse 1. The Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the south, heard that Israel came by the way of the Atharim. He fought against Israel and took some of them captive. Comment, we remember that right after the spies brought a bad report, Israel refused to enter the land. Yahweh rebuked Israel and told them the current generation of warriors from 20 years old and up would never enter the promised land. But some of them tried to go up anyway and attack the Canaanites. The Canaanites beat them back, Numbers 14:45. Here in verse 1, the king of Arad didn't appreciate those spies, and he took some Israelites captive. This took place on the southern edge of Canaan, which is the point of the hook. Verse 2, Israel vowed a vow to Yahweh and said, If you will indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. Comment, a vow in Israel is a holy matter to be conducted according to the law of Leviticus chapter 27. Israel has vowed, Yahweh, if you'll let us defeat them, we will utterly destroy their cities. It's a vow of destruction. They won't take anything away but their captives. Verse 3, Yahweh listened to the voice of Israel and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities. The name of that place was called Hormah. Comment, Hormah means destruction. There would be a temptation for someone to break the vow and put something in his pocket like some gold or whatever, but no one did that we know of. It was a show of faith. Verse 4, They traveled from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. The soul of the people was very discouraged because of the journey. Comment, they went from the hook point to the curve. Mount Hor is at the bottom of the curve below the country of Edom. Edom rests in the crook of the J. Then they started up the curve of the hook going around Edom. But this verse brings to mind a question. What body of water did Yahweh part when Israel escaped Egypt? Traditionally, we think of the Red Sea crossing as being at the Gulf of Suez, which is next to the populated area of Egypt. But this verse places the Red Sea near Mount Hor, so that brings the Gulf of Aqaba into the picture. The names of places change over time, and the actual geography changes over time as the position of coastlines change. So we're in the dark about the actual site of the crossing. Verse 4, Israel is, quote, very discouraged because of the journey, end quote. Certainly travel was difficult through a barren desert. They were exposed to the elements, carrying all of their tents and belongings by hand. So if they were very discouraged, we can understand it if we put ourselves in their shoes. But although we understand it, we can't ever afford to let ourselves become discouraged under any circumstances because God's with us. But Israel's discouragement is about to get out of hand. Verse 5, The people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread and there is no water, and our soul loathes this disgusting bread. Comment, the disgusting bread they talk about is the manna that comes straight from God. We might understand them better if we remember they've been camping in the desert 40 years now. In modern times, the daytime high temperature averages 110 degrees in the summer, and 40 years is a long time to eat just manna. We can't excuse them, but we can see their point. It's a bread and water diet. Now we come to a famous passage. They complained, and verse 6, Yahweh sent venomous snakes among the people, and they bit the people. Many people of Israel died. The people came to Moses and said, We have sinned because we have spoken against Yahweh and against you. Pray to Yahweh that he take away the serpents from us. Moses prayed for the people. Yahweh said to Moses, Make a venomous snake and set it on a pole. It shall happen that everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. Moses made a serpent of brass and set it on the pole. If a serpent had bitten any man, when he looked at the serpent of brass, he lived. Comment, They complained, and Yahweh sent venomous snakes or serpents to bite them. This sounds similar to some of the plagues Yahweh put on the Egyptians. 1 Corinthians 10 refers to this passage, verses 9 through 13, quote, "Let's not test Christ as some of them tested and perished by the serpents. Don't grumble as some of them also grumbled and perished by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them by way of example, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands be careful that he doesn't fall. No temptation has taken you except what is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above what you are able, but with the temptation also makes the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." So that's the end of that quote. And whatever difficult thing might happen to us is something that's common to mankind. Trials may be very extreme and prolonged, like this one in the desert, but God will not allow us to be tempted beyond our ability. He'll make a way of escape so that we're able to endure. That is, He'll make a way for us to endure without sinning. The escape is there if we look for it. Verse 9, at Yahweh's command, Moses made a brass snake, set it on a pole, and anyone who looked at it lived. Look is Hebrew nabat, which means look intently or gaze with attention. The snake is Christ, and the pole is the cross. We know that for certain because Jesus said, John 3, verses 14 and 15, quote, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life," end quote. Yahweh's after simplicity with this picture. They looked at the serpent and they lived. If we believe in Christ, we will live. Quote, "Whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life," end quote. So don't just give him a glance. Check him out very thoroughly with all your attention, like your life depends on it, because it does. This passage about the serpent is one of many, many places that the Bible verifies itself. It speaks of Christ about 1,300 years before he came. So how do we know the Bible's true? For one thing, because it verifies itself. Verse 10, the children of Israel traveled and encamped at Oboth. They traveled from Oboth and encamped at Abarim in the wilderness, which is before Moab, toward the sunrise. Comment, now Israel has come to the strait of the J. They passed to the east of Edom, and now they're east of Moab. Verse 12, from there they traveled and encamped in the valley of Zered. Comment, that's the valley that separates Moab and Edom. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 14 tells us the Zered Valley was an extremely important landmark for Israel, because by the time they got there, Yahweh had consumed all the men of war of the older generation who refused to enter the promised land. It's been 38 years since they arrived at Kadesh. All the old generation is gone now except Joshua and Caleb and Moses. Yahweh said that Joshua and Caleb would enter the land because they were the only two faithful spies, Numbers 14:13. So those two have been living all this time knowing that they were not killable, if we can use that word. Yahweh won't let them die, at least until they get in the land. And Yahweh said that Moses would not enter because of his error at the waters of Meribah, Numbers 20, verse 2. He took credit there for the water, and he struck the rock rather than speaking to it. So Moses has to die before they enter the land, but he's the only one remaining who is doomed. Verse 13, from there they traveled and encamped on the other side of the Arnon, which is in the wilderness that comes out on the border of the Amorites. For the Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. Comment, the Zered is a tributary of the Dead Sea. It's mostly dry unless it rains. They've gone north from that valley, the valley of Zered, to the next major tributary north, which is the Arnon River, which is also a tributary of the Dead Sea. Moab lies between those two valleys, between the Zered and the Arnon. Beyond the Arnon, north of the Arnon, is Amorite country. So in review, they passed east of Edom, going north, and east of Moab without attacking anybody, because Edom was Jacob's twin brother. Moab was Lot's older son, so they're not attacking their relatives, and these places aren't part of the promised land. Coming up, verses 14 and 15 mention a lost book, the book of the wars of Yahweh. The quote given here is all that we have of that book. Verse 14, therefore it is said in the book of the wars of Yahweh, Vaheb and Suphah, the valleys of the Arnon, the slope of the valleys that incline toward the dwelling of Ar, leans on the border of Moab. From there they traveled to Beer, which is the well of which Yahweh said to Moses, gather the people together, and I will give them water. Then Israel sang this song, spring up, well, sing to it, the well which the princes dug, which the nobles of the people dug, with the scepter and with their poles. Comment, verse 16, Be'er simply means well. We don't know the exact location of it, but according to the song, Israel dug the well. Yahweh somehow supplying them with water in the desert everywhere he leads them. Going on, from the wilderness they traveled to Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Nahaliel, and from Nahaliel to Bamoth, and from Bamoth to the valley that is in the field of Moab, to the top of Pisgah, which looks down on the desert. Comment, Mattanah, Nahaliel, and Bamoth are obscure, but they're in the vicinity of Moab. Verse 20, they came to Mount Pisgah, which is just east of the upper end of the Dead Sea. It's the farthest north we've seen them so far. It's a little farther up the straight part of the J. Verse 21, Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your land. We will not turn away into field or vineyard. We will not drink of the water of the wells. We will go by the king's highway until we have passed your border. Comment, they've crossed over the Arnon River, or the dry riverbed, past Moab and come to Amorite country. The Amorites are one of the Canaanite tribes. Genesis chapter 10, the man Canaan gave rise to 11 tribes, including the Amorites. Most of the Canaanites are on the other side of the Dead Sea and other side of the Jordan, but Sihon, king of the Amorites, lives here, east of the Dead Sea and the Jordan. Yahweh told Abraham over 400 years ago that his descendants would be slaves in Egypt, but in the fourth generation they would come again to Canaan, quote, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full, end quote. But now time's up for these Amorites under King Sihon. There are other Amorite kings elsewhere, but Sihon will be the first to go down. Deuteronomy chapter 2 adds some detail to this episode. Moses sent this peaceful message to Sihon, king of the Amorites, this please let me just pass through type of message. But Moses already knew that Yahweh had given Sihon into his hands, Deuteronomy 2:24. Deuteronomy 2:25, Yahweh says he's beginning to, quote, put the dread of you and the fear of you on the peoples who are under the whole sky, who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. End quote. Coming up, Sihon seals his fate. Verse 23, Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his border, but Sihon gathered all his people together and went out against Israel into the wilderness and came to Jahaz. He fought against Israel. Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and possessed his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, even to the children of Ammon, for the border of the children of Ammon was strong. Comment, they just took Sihon's land from the Arnon River, which was his border with Moab, north to the Jabbok River. Boom, that's a 50-mile swath from north to south. The fear and dread of Israel is beginning to fall on every nation. From this point on, the nations around are trembling and in anguish, Deuteronomy 2:25. The Ammonites are just to the east of this newly conquered Amorite territory. Verse 24, the Ammonite border is strong. Israel's not going to take their land, and they're not going to try. The Ammonites are not Canaanites. Ammon was Lot's second son. Moab was Lot's first son. So they're not taking Edom, Moab, or Ammon, and they're not going to because Yahweh isn't giving them. These people are safe because they're related to Abraham and Lot. But back to Sihon, the Amorite king, and his cities, verse 25. Israel took all these cities. Israel lived in all the cities of the Amorites, in Heshbon and in all its villages. Comment, these are the first real homes Israel has possessed since they left Egypt. Coming up, Moses delves into a little of King Sihon's history. Verse 26, "For Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and taken all his land out of his hand, even to the Arnon. Therefore those who speak in Proverbs say, 'Come to Heshbon, let the city of Sihon be built and established. For a fire has gone out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It has devoured Ar of Moab, the lords of the high places of the Arnon. Woe to you, Moab! You are undone, people of Chemosh. He has given his sons as fugitives and his daughters into captivity to Sihon, king of the Amorites. We have shot at them. Heshbon has perished, even to Dibon. We have laid waste even to Nophah, which reaches to Medeba." Comment: in other words, in former times, Sihon the Amorite took Moab's land, pushing him back to the Arnon Valley. So in conquering Sihon, Israel has conquered the conqueror. With Yahweh's help, they're in a process of pushing out nations greater and mightier than themselves. Deuteronomy 4, verse 38. Verse 31, "Thus Israel lived in the land of the Amorites. Moses sent to spy out Jazer. They took its villages and drove out the Amorites who were there. They turned and went up by the way of Bashan. Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei." Comment: Og is another Amorite king even farther north. Verse 34, "Yahweh said to Moses, 'Don't fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand with all his people and his land. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon.' So they struck him with his sons and all his people until there were no survivors, and they possessed his land." Comment: first they defeated the Amorite king Sihon, then they defeated the Amorite king Og. Deuteronomy 3:8, Israel now possesses a continuous piece of land on the east side of the Jordan, all the way from the valley of the Arnon on the south to Mount Hermon on the north. Mount Hermon is the top of the J. That's 135 miles of land from north to south. But as yet they possess nothing to the west of the Jordan. They don't possess the main part of the promised land. Deuteronomy 3 verse 4, the northern part they just took from King Og the Amorite includes 60 fortified cities with high walls, gates, and bars, in addition to a great many villages without walls. That's the chapter. This is a different generation. They're showing faith and it's paying off. Numbers 22 is next. You can find it easily at landofhavilah.net. Numbers 22. Here's the map of Numbers 21. This is the main part of Canaan. Israel destroyed the cities of the king of Arad in this area on the southern edge of Canaan, and Israel got their people back. Edom was in this area. Edom denied passage, so the Israelites went around by way of Mount Hor and came up to the east of Edom. Mount Hor is here, so they came around here to the east of Edom. This is the Zered Valley, which is usually dry. It's a tributary of the Dead Sea. The Zered was the border between Edom down here and Moab up here. And by the time they got to the Zered, all the former generation had died except for Joshua, Caleb, and Moses. They skirted Moab to the east. Moab's in this area, and they didn't bother Moab either. Here's the Arnon River, which is also a tributary of the Dead Sea. Moab at this time was between the Zered here and the Arnon here, in the area in between. As soon as they crossed the Arnon here, they were in Amorite country to the north of it. Sihon the Amorite was in this area. This is Heshbon. This was Sihon's capital. He ruled from here, and Heshbon still bears the same name to this day. Og the Amorite was farther north in this area. Israel conquered Og and took over all his land, all the way to Mount Hermon up here. This is Hermon. So between the Arnon here and Mount Hermon, it's now 135 miles of Israelite territory. We can see that modern Amman, Jordan, is here, still bearing the name of Ammon. The Ammonites were in this area. They're lost descendants, and Yahweh's not directing Israel to attack them. As to the question of the Red Sea, it could have been the Gulf of Suez here or the Gulf of Aqaba here, but if we only went by this chapter, we would assume it was the Gulf of Aqaba over here. See you for Numbers 22.